Stoichiometry is the science of measuring chemicals that go into and come out of any given reaction. The reason for our investigation was to determine the limiting and excess reactants in each test tube. Whichever reactant is used completely during the reaction, it is called the limiting reactant. Once the reaction stops, some reactant is going to be left over. The reactant that was not left over is also known as the excess reactant.
The materials we are using for our investigation is copper 2 sulfate, potassium hydroxide, 2 burets, 8 test tubes. We later put both solutions in each test tube with a specific amount of solution. The method we used to experiment with is that each test tube had its limit of each solution. Then we added water. We later mixed each test tube with the solution and watched the reaction for 15 minutes.
Potassium hydroxide is a clear solution, while copper 2 sulfate appears as a blue solution. When both chemicals react, they form a precipitate. Each test tube had a precipitate that formed within. In test tubes 1, 2, and 3, the precipitate was less than 10 millimeters. Test tube 4 and 5 had a precipitate between 50 millimeters and 60 millimeters. Test tube 6 had the greatest amount of precipitate, which was 80 millimeters. Finally, test tubes 7 and 8 had a precipitate between 70 to 75 millimeters each. Copper 2 sulfate solution reacts with potassium hydroxide. A blue precipitate is formed. The color of the precipitate indicates which transition metal ion was in the initial solution. In test tubes 1, 2, 3, and 4, the limiting reactant is potassium hydroxide, since the amount of potassium hydroxide was less than the amount of copper sulfate. In test tubes 5, 6, 7, and 8, the limiting reactant changed. Therefore, the limiting reactant was copper sulfate because it allowed for certain amounts of copper hydroxide to be produced, causing potassium hydroxide to be the excess reactant.